Hello everyone, it's Card Snap here, and today we will be going over the top 5 cube stealers in Marvel Snap. What this category is referring to are cards that disproportionately win 4 and 8 cube games. They don't have to be the most consistent at winning games, but when they do win, they tend to win the most amount of cubes. Usually you put these type of cards in your deck as extra cards that aren't in your core package, but they are this influx of higher cube gains, and that's how a lot of top players increase their cube gain in certain decks that have extra slots. So the first of these cards is Nightmare. Nightmare will be ranking at our number 5, and Nightmare's effect is on reveal, replace the text of each card in your hand with text from a random card of the same cost. Why Nightmare is a good cube stealer is because in these highball decks, which I will be calling them, with these decks with a lot of big guys like Cull Obsidian, even Misery decks, even Sentry decks, like all these like 4-10s, 4-9s, these big body decks, a lot of the time, are predictable, and that is a major problem with these big decks. Is they're predictable, and your opponent can basically calculate your range very predictably, so they can know when they can beat you and they know when they can't beat you, and that leads to a lot more retreats, which leads to a lot less on average cubes. However, when you play Nightmare, the thing that's really strong about him is that it creates random strong effects some of the time on these high base power cards. So you have this floor, Nightmare becomes this insane ceiling where your opponent can't really play around. For example, one game, I got a Cull Obsidian Moon Girl, and I got a Surge that became Gorgon. I Moon Girled my Gorgon, and I was playing against a discard deck, and he was about to put up like 100 points if I didn't have the counter to him. But since I had the counter to him in that random Gorgon, I ended up winning that game. And that's a situation where Nightmare might just win you 8 cubes off of this randomness, which is not available to the other deck. So this is how Nightmare helps these big body decks and why he's ranked number 5. Ideally, Nightmare has these very certain decks he wants to be in. He wants to be in Merlin decks because him being a 3-1 body is very significant, and Merlin kind of counteracts that because you can once and future him, or you can polymorph him, and you can create some value out of him being a 3 cost that goes into a 4, whereas normally he creates no value. So Merlin helps create that baseline of value with Nightmare on the floor, and then he likes these high power cards, which is often why you see him in like Sauron decks and like these Misery decks and like a bunch of other decks revolving around either Merlin or just big bodies in general. So our number 4 card is Helien. This is a bit of an underrated card in my opinion. His effect is on reveal. Next turn you can move cards to this location. He has obviously synergies with move, but I have been using him outside in other decks, and he has been a cube stealer for me. Yes, his effect is face up, but what he does is create this uncertainty in card placement that allows you the freedom to make decisions, and your opponent is very hard to play around that. And often you'll surprise opponents by the way you move it, by the way you move the cards on the board and the extra cards you place on the board, and it gives you basically an efficiency effect where Helien creates these very efficient lanes because you end up going only tall into 2 lanes, and you abandon 1 lane that your opponent invested in, and then basically where all your points are going are super efficient. And that's why Helien is a very good card, and he's this cube stealer because your opponent, it's very hard for them to predict where your Helien is going to go ultimately. Ideally, Helien wants to be played in decks with large early bodies. I played him in an Agatha deck, and it felt really good having that 4/14 Ebony Blade that could either stay in the lane, and then the opponent had to play around beating the Ebony Blade, but the opponent also had to play around beating the Ebony Blade in the other lane, which made reads very difficult. He also likes deck with large finishers. A lot of the time in that deck, I was ghost riding back my Agatha. That's adding like 20 points to the other lane I decide to commit in. So now I can play basically, I can choose 2 lanes, but my opponent doesn't know which 2 lanes I'm choosing, and I created a very hard effect. If you can make large early body with large finishers, Helien becomes this very cheap card, very cheaty card that is very hard to predict and read, which makes him a cube stealer because you can find the perfect play, but your opponent has trouble identifying what your perfect play is, which are the types of cards that are cube stealers. When your opponent struggles to understand what you're doing, but you understand what you're doing and create the value from that difference. And obviously he has these inbuilt synergy move decks, and I've seen a couple move decks pop up with Helien, and Helien seems to be this underrated cube stealer that I think a lot more people should deck build with, especially if your deck can fit in a 5 drop as like an extra play that you want to play on turn 5. The next card, speaking of 5 drops, is Legion. Legion to me is the number 3 cube stealer. His effect is on reveal. Replace each other location with this one. And why Legion is so good is there is a number of locations that Legion basically has these very, very unique game-winning interactions with. And he provides 2 different values. One of them is he's a big body location controller. So a lot of times if there's a troubling location for you, let's say there is that one location where you can play 4, 5s, and 6s, and you're predominantly in your hand is 4, 5, and 6s. You can get rid of that with Legion, and then you can play into there. That's like the pseudo location control, which helps you a bit. But where he gets really unique is his ability for some locations just to say Legion can win this game by himself. Doesn't matter how down you are, how ahead you are, you can win this game under certain conditions, and if you follow those conditions, you'll win. The best example of this is that one location that says you lose the game if you have more, you lose the location if you have more power there. You can smack a Legion there, and it goes to all 3 locations. And your opponent's expecting to win the game off of having more power as the game regularly works, but it flips the game on its head. And that's why Legion is such a good cube stealer, because he flips the game on its head, and a lot of the time it's hard to predict which decks are running Legion, and it's even harder to memorize all these interactions that work with Legion. But when you're playing Legion, a lot of time you're already thinking about Legion from the very beginning, so you can apply that into the late game. So a lot of time your opponent doesn't understand what's going on, but since you're playing this Legion deck and you're used to playing Legion decks and you're starting to get a grasp of the interaction, he just steals a ton of cubes because your opponent has no idea what's going on, but you have an idea what's going on, and you're just stealing these cubes from these very unique interactions in a variety of ways depending on what type of deck you're running alongside what locations happen to be there. There's a lot of variance in the locations, but a lot of locations surprisingly work very well with Legion. The ideal decks for Legion are energy ramp decks. Why energy ramp decks are so good is because if you can play Legion on turn 4, a lot of time it's very deadly. There's a lot of locations where if you can play Legion on turn 4, you just end up super winning super hard, because it's like this very... like your opponent's only bringing up their 4-drop at this point, and they're only starting to get ready, but you've ramped ahead and then you play Legion, and a lot of time that's very, very hard for a regular deck to beat, because they're going at a regular pace and you're ramping into something chaotic very early, which doesn't allow them to properly build up their game plan. Another very good appeal is decks that play 5+1. Instantly I think about like a Black Bolt deck. You play Black Bolt, and then that last turn you have Stature plus a 5. Legion's very good in that role because he kind of just rug pulls at the very end of the game, and there's a lot of unique interaction with that, where you can play one big body alongside Legion for like this extra location weirdness value, and a lot of times you just end up winning the game like that. And the third category list is just generic good cards list. A lot of time you can justify Legion in just these lists that are running a bunch of generic good cards, and you need a 5-drop. And since Legion has the ability to just snowball random games in your favor, a lot of the time the 5/7 location control value is good enough for a card that will just randomly win you games based on unique interactions. And he often makes like these weirder good card lists. I think the last thing I saw like that was like a Baltrox Silk list. He just made it in because he's that good of a 5-drop, and the deck had room to play him on 5 or 6 often. So he just became a really good card in that way. The second to last card, or the second best card, is Juggernaut. Now, I want to note for Juggernaut is Juggernaut not in here because of the amount of surprise it is. There is a degree to which you can play around Juggernaut that is easier than the other cards. However, Juggernaut is in here just by his sheer density and volume of cube stealing games. Like, he just is so efficient at what he does that he ranks over all these other cards that have more unique interactions, that provide these bigger effects, because he just does the cube stealing more often than any other single card. He does it even more than the number 1 card, but the number 1 card a lot of time is just winning you games in a more surprising way for these bigger cube stealing games. But Juggernaut is probably the most efficient 2-cube, 4-cube stealing games constantly. You can start to play around him, but you can only start to play around him at a really, really high level. For those of you who don't know, Juggernaut's effect is on reveal, move away all enemy cards played here this turn. What that does is 2 things. The first one is common sense. Juggernaut is very good at winning closely contested lanes, and that's why he often steals Q'd, because your opponent's like, okay, I only died at Juggernaut, surely my opponent doesn't have Juggernaut, this deck might not seem like it has Juggernaut, and then he ends up winning these very close lanes in a way that just gets you a lot of cubes in general. However, Juggernaut also here, because he has a unique property like Legion, where he is uniquely good in a certain set of locations. These are two types of locations that incentivize you to play here, and locations that disincentivize you to play here. Something, for example, is Kill. It says after turn 4, you can't play here. Juggernaut's uniquely good into Kill because it's incentivizing you to play early cards there. Juggernaut pushes out the card, and suddenly, by playing Juggernaut on turn 4, you just one Kill, and you won one location, and you can build up the second location to win 2 locations like that. He's very good into stuff like that. However, on the flip side, there is that previously mentioned location that says whoever has the most power here loses that location. Juggernaut is uniquely good into locations that disincentivize you to play like that location. Because what you do is you play Juggernaut on another location, he pushes all the stuff out, it goes into that location that's disincentivized to play, and then Juggernaut has now won you 2 locations effectively like that. Another one is the location that adds 2 Raptors. By playing an early Juggernaut, some of the time you can push a smaller card into the Raptor lane, effectively winning you the Raptor lane because your opponent doesn't have enough space to properly contest you, or automatically just got clogged from that Juggernaut play some of the time. So he is uniquely good at scamming out these weird games like that. The ideal decks for Juggernaut to play in are these 3+3 decks. The best example of this is Surfer, or Surfer also always wants to play a 3-drop and a 3-drop last turn, which means Juggernaut's really good because you can play that, you can play Juggernaut alongside another card consistently. These tempo decks are very good with Juggernaut as well because you're tempoing out, you're getting ahead in one lane and you're putting a significant amount of power in another lane. Juggernaut will be that very close lane where you're putting some power in, but your opponent's still contesting it. Push it out to the other lane where your opponent might contest it less, and then Juggernaut's just winning that. And then in general, Juggernaut's very good with these energy cheat generic tech decks. Let's say your final turn is playing a Zabud Shang-Chi or Zabud Enchantress. That will often win you that one lane, and then Juggernaut can win that second lane by kind of having that 3+3 effect as well, but with these tech decks that are a bit more expensive, but play this energy cheat like Sarah or Zabu or Surge to get a bit cheaper cards. Juggernaut plays a good role in that deck as well as a cube stealing card. And last but not least, who was on the thumbnail? Copycat. Copycat is one of my favorite cards. And what Copycat's effect is when you draw this, copy the text from the bottom card of your opponent's deck. On surface, this doesn't seem too strong, but the reason Copycat is so good is most decks have one or multiple effects that on a 3/5 body basically instantly win you the game. Like the common example is like a deck running Iron Man, you have a 1 in 12 chance to win. A deck running Gore, you have another 1 in 12 chance to win. And your opponent reasonably can't play around that Copycat copying whatever. Something like Surfer has like Brood, Carter, and if you're playing the Mirror, it has Surfer and Gwenpool, and there's like 4 cards that can win you the game in that matchup. Affliction has both Ajax and Luke Cage that can just win you an Affliction matchup. There's so many like 2 in 12 chances, 1 in 12 chances, 4 in 12 chances among the decks that Copycat just becomes this incredibly consistent cube stealer that your opponent has no tell on playing. Like in Juggernaut, you can be like, my opponent's running Juggernaut, where would they play Juggernaut? Okay, I can predict that. Copycat's a lot harder. People don't really look in their deck to see what's remaining. So a lot of time where Copycat's like, oh my god, how am I supposed to play around a 3/5 Brood? It becomes very hard, and Copycat is this constant cube stealer because there's always that 1 or 2 cards in the deck that Copycat will basically free roll a game with, and you can snap on that free roll and your opponent reasonably has no idea what's happening. A lot of time that's 8 cubes with cards like Luke Cage, Brood and all that. Sometimes if you need to play a card earlier like Gwenpool, she'll steal 2 cubes, you'll play Gwenpool, your opponent will end up retreating because she's that ahead on that card. Ideally, Copycat is very good in these 3+3 decks like Surfer, yet again, in the same way Juggernaut is, that if you're playing a 3/5 Iron Man in one lane, you can play alongside Surfer, you can play it alongside Juggernaut. That's enough usually to win just both lanes. So he's good in these generic tech decks, where she's just that last extra card, and like the tech deck is doing what it wants. It doesn't mind that 3/5 body, but occasionally Copycat will just free roll that and give the tech deck an influx of power, which basically helps free roll a game. Notably, Copycat is especially good in decks with small cores. What I mean by that is decks that, let's say, only their power engine is only 8 cards and they have like an extra 4 cards that can be whatever. Copycat is very good in decks like that, or decks that have 10 cards and the last 2 cards can be whatever, because she is just this extra card, and she's basically saying you're going to play a pretty much baseline card some of the time, and if your deck is okay with playing this baseline card some of the time, you will just free roll and instantly win games. And that's why, to me, Copycat is one of the best cube stealers in the entire game. With that, I want to thank you all for watching, and I want you to consider how your deck might be able to fit in one of these. Nightmares, there'll be a lot more niche. You can probably fit in one of the last 4, and it, in my opinion, will help your cube game, if not both your cube game and your win rate, depending on what cards you're placing. If you guys haven't checked out my Twitch, feel free to check me out at twitch.tv at Heart of the Card Snap. It's the same username as my YouTube. I stream more or less like 3 to 4 times a week, playing often the cards I'm talking about or implementing the strategies I'm talking about, and I usually play at like a top 25, top 50 level, depending on the season. If I'm feeling good about the season, it's often top 10. Thank you all for watching.